I still hear my father's words like shards of glass cutting the air, slicing into me in front of everyone who mattered most. "We're not your bank anymore, Elias." The tone wasn't just dismissive, it was smug, calculated, dripping with the arrogance of a man who believed money was the only true language. His lips curled with satisfaction, as though humiliating me in front of Marina and our children, Ethan and Lila, was some twisted performance for his amusement. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. I could hear the faint clink of Celeste's diamond bracelet as she shifted in her chair, the smug chuckle from Damien as he reached for another glass of wine, and the whisper of chandeliers overhead. My kids froze, eyes darting between their grandfather's gloating expression and my face, searching for reassurance I didn't yet know how to give. And then, buzz. My phone vibrated against the polished oak table, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I glanced down, and there it was, a message from my trust manager, Gavin. Approve their $15,000 monthly allowances. The irony hit like thunder. They weren't cutting me off. No, they were reminding me of my supposed duty to keep them afloat. They had spent years treating me like a tool, an endless stream of cash, and now they dared to parade this independence in front of my children while expecting me to quietly press approve. In that instant, the truth slammed into me with all its weight. My parents never saw me as family. To them, I wasn't Elias, the hardworking son who clawed his way through law school, the father raising children with love, the man who endured decades of humiliation in silence. No. I was nothing more than their private bank. A vault to be opened when their golden children, Damien and Celeste, wanted yachts, jewelry, or designer vacations. I sat there, heart pounding, the laughter of my siblings echoing in my ears, realizing that the family I had sacrificed so much to honor had never once honored me. Their love came with conditions: give more, pay more, sacrifice more. And when I finally faltered, they were ready to strip me of dignity in front of those I loved most. But here's the thing about humiliation, it doesn't always break you. Sometimes it builds a fire. As I looked at Ethan's confused eyes and Lila's trembling lip, I felt something inside me shift. This wasn't just about allowances, or wealth, or pride. It was about legacy. It was about showing my children that a man's worth is not defined by how much abuse he can endure for the sake of appearances. What happened next didn't just fracture the fragile balance of the Marlowe family, it obliterated it. The hierarchy that placed Damien on a pedestal and treated me as invisible would crumble. The masks would fall, secrets would spill, and the mighty would kneel. And I promise you this, the final twist will leave you stunned. My name is Elias Marlowe, and at 38 years old, I wear many titles. A corporate attorney with years of cases behind me, a husband to Marina, and a father to Ethan and Lila. Every piece of my life has been built from discipline and sacrifice. Nothing ever fell into my lap. No shortcuts, no golden ladder extended from above. Just grit, persistence, and a refusal to give up when life pressed its weight against me. People who see me now often assume I was born into privilege because of the family name, but the truth is different. Growing up in the Marlowe household was a lesson in inequality wrapped in silk curtains and marble floors. My younger brother, Damien, was the golden child. Spoiled, reckless, endlessly adored. He didn't need to succeed, his failures were disguised as potential. His mistakes were brushed aside with indulgent laughter, as though his very existence was an achievement worth celebrating. My sister Celeste took a different path. Polished, sharp-tongued, and venomous when she wanted to be, she learned early that beauty could replace effort. She wielded charm like a blade, winning favor from our parents with a smile while slipping the dagger of her mockery into my side. For Celeste, appearance was everything, and in a family obsessed with reputation, that was enough to make her untouchable. And then there was me. I was the child who learned that if I wanted a future, I would have to carve it out with my own hands. At 16, while Damien crashed the brand new car he had been gifted, I was holding down 2 jobs just to afford textbooks. I stocked shelves in the early mornings and delivered papers at night, my fingers raw from the work, my back aching before I was even grown. No one noticed. No one praised me. In fact, my father once said, "A Marlowe shouldn't have to do menial work," as if my determination was an embarrassment. Victor Marlowe, my father, was a man who worshipped wealth. To him, money wasn't a tool, it was the very definition of worth. He paraded success in public, cared deeply about how the Marlowe name sounded at parties, and made it clear that reputation was the family's altar. And my mother, Elena, stood silently at his side. She rarely raised her voice, rarely contradicted him, and though I longed for her to defend me, her silence became another form of loyalty to the empire my father guarded. In a house filled with chandeliers and echoing hallways, I learned what it meant to be invisible. My siblings basked in the glow of favoritism while I worked twice as hard for half as much recognition. Every small achievement of mine was brushed aside, while Damien and Celeste were applauded for mediocrity. For years, I swallowed the humiliation. I told myself to be patient, to endure, to believe that someday my efforts would be enough to change how they saw me. But deep down, a fire was already burning. And no matter how tightly I tried to smother it, the day would come when I couldn't hold it in anymore. The Marlowe estate was a mausoleum of cold wealth, a monument built not to shelter love but to showcase power. Every corner gleamed with excess, crystal chandeliers casting their harsh light over endless portraits of ancestors who stared down from gilded frames as though silently judging anyone who didn't measure up. The marble floors echoed with footsteps, amplifying even the smallest sound until silence itself felt like an accusation. On the surface, it glittered. Beneath, it suffocated. Damien thrived in that suffocation, or at least he believed he did. He lived recklessly, a prince of indulgence whose mistakes were always rescued with another infusion of family money. Sports cars lined the driveway, nightclubs bore his name until they crumbled in bankruptcy, and still he was praised as ambitious, as daring, as the sun carrying the Marlowe spirit forward. He mistook excess for achievement and recklessness for courage. Celeste played her role differently but no less extravagantly. She curated her perfect life for the world to see, every photo carefully staged, every caption dripping with envy-inducing charm. Designer handbags dangled from her arm like trophies, each one another subtle reminder that she belonged in the spotlight while the rest of us existed in the shadows. She was polished, elegant, and dangerous in her ability to make people believe the performance. Meanwhile, Marina and I lived in a modest townhouse far removed from marble and chandeliers. Our home smelled of fresh coffee in the mornings and the faint scent of Marina's lavender candles at night. Ethan spent hours bent over chessboards, planning strategies with the focus of someone far beyond his years. Lila painted sunsets on scraps of paper, turning the ordinary into something extraordinary with a child's unfiltered imagination. They didn't need chandeliers or marble walls, they needed love, warmth, and a sense of belonging. And yet, every time we stepped back into the estate, all that love seemed to evaporate under the weight of comparison. My children were treated as outsiders in a family that was supposed to be theirs by blood. I remember last year's Christmas dinner vividly. The dining hall smelled of roasted meats and spiced wine, and the grand tree glittered with gold ornaments. Damien unwrapped a Rolex, the applause ringing almost as loudly as the laughter that followed. Celeste peeled back the velvet paper to reveal a diamond bracelet, her smile catching every flash of the cameras she had invited to witness her curated joy. Then Ethan's turn came. He opened a small box, his eyes lighting up with hope only to dim when he saw what lay inside. A chipped toy car, secondhand, clearly discarded by someone else before it found its way to him. His little hand gripped it tightly, trying to hide the disappointment from me. Later, as the laughter of his uncle and aunt filled the room, he leaned closer and whispered, "Dad, why don't they like us?" I stared into his eyes, searching for an answer that could soften the truth. But there was none I could give. The silence I held in that moment was heavier than any words I could have spoken. It was the silence of a father realizing that the cruelty he had endured his whole life was now being passed down to his children. And it was the silence that planted the seed for everything that would follow. This cruelty wasn't new. It was the rhythm of my childhood, a drumbeat of humiliation that carried into adulthood, each strike a reminder that no matter what I achieved, it would never be enough. The Marlowe estate might have been lined with gold, but for me, it was a place where dignity was stripped away piece by piece. I remember the day I graduated at the top of my law class. Years of late nights, endless study sessions, and sacrifices that nearly broke me had finally borne fruit. I walked across the stage with honors, my professors shaking my hand, their words filled with respect. When I returned home, I found Victor in his study. He barely looked up from his newspaper. His only response was a grunt, followed by a dismissive, "That's what's expected." No pride, no acknowledgement. Just cold indifference. 2 weeks later, Damien threw a yacht party. He hadn't earned it, it was bought with borrowed money and reckless arrogance. Yet the family gathered in celebration, champagne flowing, fireworks lighting up the night sky. My father raised his glass to toast him, his voice booming with pride. Watching from the sidelines, I realized then that effort meant nothing in our family. Appearances were everything. Years later, when Lila fell ill and needed surgery, I swallowed my pride and asked for help. I still remember the way Victor's eyes narrowed, his voice low and cutting. "Real men don't beg, Elias." The words sank deep, leaving scars that even time couldn't heal. And yet, only months later, Damien's failed nightclub was bleeding money. Without hesitation, my parents quietly funneled millions to save him, calling it an investment in his future. The hypocrisy was staggering. Even in small moments, the message was clear. At family dinners, I was the one asked to pour the wine, moving quietly around the table like a servant in my own bloodline, while Damien lounged at the head, his chair a throne he never earned. Celeste's laughter cut sharper than any knife. She once pointed at my thrift store tie in front of her friends, sneering, "Did you borrow that from a charity shop?" Their laughter echoed against the marble walls as my face burned. Underneath the table, I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms until they nearly drew blood. I whispered to myself, so low that only I could hear, "I can endure this. Just hold on." For years, that was my mantra. Hold on. Endure. Survive. But endurance has limits. It doesn't last forever. Every dismissal, every insult, every cruel comparison was a crack in the dam. And one day, I knew it would all break. That limit broke the night my father snapped, shattering any illusions I had left about where I stood in the family. We were gathered around the long oak table in the grand dining hall. Silver cutlery gleamed against porcelain plates, and chandeliers poured their harsh glow across the room like full suns. The air smelled of roasted lamb and red wine, yet for me, the taste of bitterness lingered stronger than any feast. My children sat stiffly beside me, their small hands folded neatly as if they were afraid of making the wrong move. Marina, across from me, wore a careful smile, the kind that masked unease but couldn't erase it. Then it came. My father leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with that familiar mix of disdain and smug superiority. His voice cut through the hall like a blade, each word meant to wound. "We're not your bank anymore, Elias. Don't look to us when you fail." The words silenced everything. Even the clinking of glasses stopped. Ethan froze mid-bite, his fork suspended in the air. Lila's eyes widened, her bottom lip trembling, though she tried to hide it. Damien smirked into his glass of wine, as if enjoying a private joke at my expense. Celeste glanced at me with barely concealed amusement, twirling the diamond bracelet on her wrist. Beneath the table, Marina's hand slid into mine. Her grip trembled, and in that moment, I felt both her fear and her silent plea, "Don't let them see you break." Buzz. My phone vibrated against the polished oak table. The sound was loud in the tense silence, almost mocking. I looked down, and there it was, Gavin's message, glowing across the screen. "Approve their $15,000 monthly allowances." I stared at the words, and suddenly the room seemed to tilt, the walls pressing in. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out the murmur of conversation that had tentatively resumed. It wasn't just a message. It was a revelation. They weren't cutting me off, as my father's performance suggested. They were cutting me open, stripping away the last shred of dignity I had, exposing the truth that had been there all along. To them, I wasn't Elias, the son who worked 2 jobs as a teenager, the man who became a lawyer through sleepless nights and sacrifice, the father who poured every ounce of himself into raising children with love. No. To them, I was nothing more than an ATM. A vault they could tap whenever Damien needed another bailout or Celeste another indulgence. I looked around the table, really seeing them for the first time without the veil of hope clouding my vision. My father's smug satisfaction. Damien's mockery. Celeste's shallow disdain. My mother's silence, always silence. And then my children, watching me, searching my face for strength, for reassurance, for something I wasn't sure I still had. For the first time in my life, I felt something inside me break. But it wasn't despair. It wasn't defeat. It was the fracture of chains that had bound me for too long. And in that break, a new strength stirred, waiting for its moment to rise. I rose slowly from my chair, the scrape of wood against marble echoing louder than it should have in the cavernous dining hall. My heart was pounding, but my voice, when it came, was steady in a way it had never been before. Years of silence, of swallowing humiliation, had finally crystallized into something unshakable. No. That's your life, not ours. Not anymore. The words left my mouth like thunder rolling across the room, shaking the very foundation of the fragile performance my family had perfected for years. Victor's fork froze halfway to his lips, his eyes narrowing as if he couldn't quite process what he had heard. Damien let out a scoff, the sound dripping with disbelief, as though the idea of me resisting was laughable. Celeste leaned back in her chair, rolling her eyes, her polished indifference concealing the flicker of unease she couldn't quite hide. But none of their reactions mattered. What mattered was the shift I felt inside me, like tectonic plates finally moving after decades of pressure. Pain had hardened into clarity, and clarity had sharpened into strength. For once, I wasn't the obedient son, the invisible sibling, the silent provider. For once, I wasn't asking for approval, begging for validation, or pleading for a scrap of affection. In that moment, I understood something profound. Power doesn't come from being handed a place at the table. Power comes from realizing you don't need their table at all. I looked at Ethan and Lila, their wide eyes fixed on me. For years, they had seen me tolerate this treatment, modeling endurance as if it were strength. But endurance without boundaries isn't strength, it's surrender. And I would not pass that lesson down to my children. They deserve to see a father who valued dignity over tradition, truth over appearances, freedom over chains. Victor finally set down his fork, his face darkening. "Elias," he said slowly, his voice thick with warning, "think very carefully about what you're doing." But I had already thought carefully. Every night I lay awake replaying years of insults, every moment I watched my children shrink under the weight of favoritism. I had thought carefully when I saw Gavin's message glowing on my phone, reminding me I was their bank, not their blood. And in that moment, all those years of calculation and patience finally bore fruit. I straightened my shoulders, my eyes never leaving my father's. I've thought about it my whole life. A stunned silence followed. Damien's smirk faltered. Celeste shifted uncomfortably. Even my mother's eyes flickered with something I couldn't name, regret, perhaps, or fear. For once, I wasn't begging for a seat at their table. I was walking away from it. And with every step, I could feel the chains I had carried for decades falling off, one by one. That night, long after the chandeliers in the dining hall had dimmed and the laughter of my siblings had dissolved into the echoes of that poisoned house, I sat alone in my study, staring at my phone. My hands should have been shaking. For years, confrontation had left me speechless, my voice drowned under the weight of their dominance. But this time was different. My pulse was steady, my breath controlled. I scrolled to Gavin's number and pressed call. When he answered, his tone was respectful, cautious, as though he sensed the storm behind my silence. "Mr. Marlowe?" My words came firm, each syllable a stone laid in a foundation I was finally building for myself. Effective immediately, freeze all discretionary payouts. No more allowances. Not a single dollar moves without my direct approval. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. On the other end, Gavin cleared his throat. "Understood, Elias." The finality in his voice was like a gavel striking wood. The decision was sealed. The fallout began almost instantly. My phone lit up in the darkness, message after message flooding the screen. Damien's words came first, dripping with outrage. "How dare you? You can't cut me off. Do you know what this does to my reputation? Moments later, Celeste's fury joined his. "You selfish bastard. You've ruined everything. This family runs on loyalty. How could you betray us?" Their desperation leapt off the screen, every exclamation mark a reminder of how deeply they had come to depend on the very lifeline I had just severed. By dawn, the call started. Victor's name flashed across the screen, and for a moment, I considered letting it ring. But I answered, because I wanted to hear the fury in his voice with my own ears. "You ungrateful child," he hissed, his words trembling with rage. "After everything we've done for you?" I didn't let him finish. My voice cut across his like a blade through fabric. "Everything you've done for me? No, Father. Everything you've taken. My work, my earnings, my dignity. Not anymore." The silence that followed was thick, electric. For the first time, he didn't have a response ready. For the first time, he had been stopped. I ended the call without waiting for his reply. And in that quiet moment, standing in the soft glow of the lamp in my study, I felt something new. Power. Not the kind Victor worshipped, the power of wealth and appearances, but the power of choice, the power of boundaries, the power of finally saying no. My entire life, they had written me into their story as a supporting character, a provider with no voice. But with that call, I took up the pen. For the first time, the power was mine. The cracks spread faster than even I anticipated. 4 years, Damien had strutted through life with the swagger of a man who thought himself invincible. His nightclub was his crown jewel, the place where he entertained celebrities, posed for photos, and pretended to be a visionary entrepreneur. But without the steady stream of family money propping it up, the facade crumbled in weeks. Creditors circled like vultures, demanding repayment he couldn't cover. Rumors swirled through the city. Damien Marlowe, the Golden Son, had built his empire on air. The headlines were merciless. The people who once begged for his attention now whispered about his downfall over champagne at other tables. Celeste's unraveling was quieter but no less brutal. Her life had always been a performance, every smile rehearsed, every Instagram post carefully curated. She played the role of the perfect wife with the perfect marriage, a woman who had it all. But perfection is a fragile mask. When her husband discovered the mountain of debts she had hidden, designer gowns, luxury vacations, jewelry bought on credit, the illusion shattered. Their marriage, once paraded as flawless, turned into public spectacle as whispers of betrayal and financial ruin leaked into the same circles she once ruled. Her diamond-studded image was tarnished beyond repair. Behind their polished smiles, ruin had always been festering, but my parents' money had covered the cracks like wallpaper. Now, with the funds cut off, the truth seeped out for all to see. And for once, I wasn't the one bleeding. For once, it wasn't me left to endure humiliation while they thrived. It was them, the chosen ones, the golden children, finally tasting the bitter flavor of consequence. One evening, Gavin called me with a tone of disbelief still clinging to his words. "Elias," he said, "they were relying entirely on those payouts. Without you, they are drowning. Their accounts are empty shells. You weren't just supporting them, you were their survival." The revelation struck me harder than I expected. All those years, they treated me as lesser, as though I wasn't good enough, as though my work and accomplishments were trivial compared to Damien's reckless charm and Celeste's shallow glitter. And yet, behind the scenes, their entire existence was tethered to me. They mocked me for working hard, but it was my hard work that kept them standing. The hypocrisy was undeniable. The Marlowe name, paraded around as a dynasty of marble and chandeliers, had been built on sand. When the tide came in, it washed away the illusions, leaving behind the fragile, broken truth. For the first time, I stood on the outside of their ruin, watching as their empire of lies collapsed under its own weight, and I felt no guilt. Only freedom. Karma arrived like a storm, swift and merciless, tearing away the glossy facade my family had carefully maintained for years. It started with Damien. For so long, he had been untouchable, driving through town in his luxury car with music blasting, windows rolled down, soaking up the envy of strangers. But one morning, the illusion shattered. His car was repossessed in public, hauled away by a tow truck as cameras clicked and neighbors whispered. Damien, red-faced and furious, screamed at the driver, his voice breaking as though sheer rage could undo the contracts he had ignored. The scene went viral within hours. Golden Marlowe's son loses his crown. The humiliation he had once delighted in giving to others had finally returned to him tenfold. Celeste's fall was quieter but equally devastating. With the money cut off, her perfectly curated life crumbled. The penthouse apartment, the lavish brunches, the constant stream of luxury she flaunted online, all gone. Within months, she was forced to downsize into a cramped apartment far from her beloved spotlight. The friends who once praised her beauty and clung to her for invitations suddenly disappeared. Without the glow of wealth behind her, she was just another face in the crowd. And she hated it. The friends, the admirers, the sycophants, all those who had once orbited Damien and Celeste like moths to a flame, vanished overnight. Loyalty built on money dissolves the moment the cash dries up. The golden siblings, once envied, became pitied, even mocked. Their laughter, which had once filled grand rooms, was replaced by whispers of failure. Meanwhile, my life began to steady in ways I hadn't thought possible. The noise of their chaos no longer reached me. Ethan joined a local chess league, his talent finally nurtured without being overshadowed by Damien's showmanship. His quiet victories brought a different kind of pride, the kind that lasts. Lila's paintings, once scattered across scrap paper at our kitchen table, began to hang proudly in local galleries, her bright colors drawing admiration from people who saw her for her talent, not her last name. And Marina, my wife who had stood beside me through every humiliation, smiled more. Her shoulders seemed lighter, her laughter freer. The constant weight of comparison, of being looked down on, had lifted. Our modest home, filled with warmth and genuine love, suddenly felt richer than any chandelier-lit mansion. For the first time, I saw the contrast laid bare, their downfall, our rise. On one side, marble walls cracking under the weight of lies. On the other, a small house glowing with peace, where love wasn't measured in dollars but in moments. It was the clearest picture of justice I had ever seen, painted not with vengeance, but with the quiet, unstoppable hand of karma. We bought a modest home, not grand or ostentatious, but warm and alive with the kind of comfort money can't buy. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors in the mornings, golden and gentle, washing away the shadows of marble and chandeliers I had grown up under. There were no echoing hallways, no portraits of stern ancestors glaring down, no polished coldness meant to intimidate. Instead, there were shelves lined with books Marina loved, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen, and walls covered in Lila's colorful paintings. It wasn't a palace. It was a sanctuary. The peace of that home was unlike anything I had ever known. No constant comparison, no silent judgment, no sense of walking on eggshells in order to fit into someone else's definition of worth. It was ours, built not on appearances but on authenticity. And in that space, our children began to blossom. Ethan, free from the silent weight of favoritism, found joy in his passions. He spent hours bent over chessboards, not just playing but analyzing, building strategies, learning discipline and patience in ways that mirrored the resilience I had once been forced to learn. I saw him smile when he won his first tournament, not because of the trophy, but because for the first time, he knew he was valued for his mind. Lila painted with a fire that couldn't be contained. What once was confined to scraps of paper at the kitchen table grew into canvases that soon hung in community spaces and local galleries. Her joy wasn't in the praise she received but in the freedom to create without ridicule. She painted sunsets, flowers, and even portraits of our family, each stroke filled with the love she had always been surrounded by in our home. Marina, who had stood with me through years of humiliation, finally breathed easier. I saw it in the way her laughter came quicker, in the way she hosted neighbors without fear of judgment, in the way she sat with me on the porch at night, her hand resting lightly in mine, as though the weight she had carried was finally gone. We built friendships with people who valued us for who we were, not what we gave. People who came to our home for connection, not for status. One evening, years later, Ethan sat with me in the living room, now taller, older, his voice deeper. He looked at me with a seriousness that belonged to someone who had learned hard truths young. "Dad," he said softly, "that was the moment everything changed for us. When you said no. When you walked away. And he was right. That one act of defiance, that single choice to value dignity over submission, became the foundation of a new legacy. Our lives no longer revolved around pleasing those who could never be pleased. They revolved around love, freedom, and the kind of peace that comes only when you finally choose yourself. It wasn't long before Victor and Elena came crawling back, the same parents who had once wielded silence and arrogance like weapons now sounding fragile in their desperation. The call came late one evening. Victor's voice, once thunderous and commanding, cracked over the line. "We didn't realize how much we needed you." For once, the man who had always towered over me sounded small, almost pitiful. Gone was the smug confidence, the unshakable authority. In its place was the trembling voice of someone who finally understood the cost of years of cruelty. For a moment, I simply listened, letting the silence stretch between us. It wasn't out of spite but out of recognition. I had waited my entire life for this shift. I wanted to hear it in his voice, to feel the weight of humility he had never allowed himself to carry before. When I finally agreed to meet, I chose the place carefully. Not the dining hall, not the chandelier-lit rooms where humiliation had been served alongside dinner. I met them at the estate's front gate. Standing there, with the once intimidating iron bars towering above us, I realized how much had changed. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't tighten. For the first time, I wasn't trembling. They arrived with faces drawn and shoulders bent, their grandeur stripped away. Victor, who had once stared at me with cold disdain, now struggled to meet my eyes. Elena, who had always remained silent in his shadow, clutched her shawl tightly, her lips pressed into a thin line as if holding back words she'd swallowed for decades. I looked at them and felt no anger, no longing for approval. Just clarity. I spoke with calm, deliberate weight. "I'll help," I said, my voice steady, but on my terms. Respect first, or nothing at all. The word struck harder than any outburst could have. Victor's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Elena lowered her gaze. They both knew the power had shifted. For years, they had written the rules, determined the roles, dictated the balance of love and loyalty. But those days were gone. As I turned to walk away, I felt the truth settle over me like sunlight breaking through clouds. They needed me now, and they knew it. The same family that once dismissed me had been brought to their knees, not by revenge, but by the simple act of me finally standing in my own strength. And in their silence, I heard their acknowledgement. The hierarchy had collapsed, and I was no longer the son they could dismiss. I was the man they could no longer control. Looking back, I once believed that losing them, my father, my mother, the siblings I had spent my life trying to please, would break me. For so long, I thought their approval was the air I breathed, that without it, I would suffocate. But I was wrong. Letting go didn't destroy me. It freed me. It stripped away the heavy chains of expectation, the suffocating grip of comparison, and the endless cycle of giving without ever receiving. Victor's arrogance, once unshakable, faded into silence. He no longer barked commands or spoke with the certainty of a man who believed himself untouchable. The calls grew fewer, the confrontations less sharp. He had been forced to see that the power he clung to wasn't his own, it had been borrowed from me all along. And when I took it back, his throne crumbled. Damien and Celeste, stripped of their endless stream of luxuries, learned a different kind of lesson. The yachts, the nightclubs, the glittering jewels, they vanished. What remained was the truth neither of them had ever been forced to face. They didn't know how to stand without the scaffolding of wealth propping them up. Their friends abandoned them, their reputations turned hollow, and for the first time, they had to learn the painful discipline of survival. I didn't take joy in their downfall, but I did recognize the justice in it. Karma had finally balanced the scales. And me? I found strength not in the family I was born into, but in the one I built with my own two hands. Marina's laughter filled the rooms of our modest home. Ethan and Lila, no longer shrinking under the weight of cruel comparisons, flourished. Ethan grew confident, sharp in his strategies, proud of every victory earned on his own merit. Lila bloomed in her art, her canvases bright and unapologetically bold, each one a reflection of the freedom she felt. They grew up unscarred by their grandparents' cruelty, untouched by the poison of conditional love. For the first time in my life, I understood what legacy truly meant. It wasn't chandeliers or marble halls. It wasn't wealth flaunted for admiration or control. Legacy was dignity. Legacy was choosing to stand tall even when it meant walking away from the very people who gave you life. And so the Marlowe story changed. It was no longer about appearances, riches, or hollow prestige. It became a story about truth, about breaking cycles of cruelty, and about building something real out of the rubble of what once was. For the first time, the Marlowe story wasn't about wealth. It was about dignity. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from the table where love is served with conditions. For years, I sat at that table, convincing myself that endurance was strength, that silence was loyalty, and that someday my sacrifices would be enough to earn the love I craved. But the truth was simpler, harsher. Love that demands payment is not love at all. It is control, it is manipulation, it is a chain disguised as affection. That night, when I told Gavin to freeze the allowances, it wasn't just about money. It was about something far greater. I didn't just cut off a financial pipeline. I cut the invisible cords that had bound me to a life of humiliation. In one decisive moment, I shattered decades of conditioning, thawing the chains that had kept me in place, breaking the cycle that said my worth depended on what I gave, not who I was. For so long, I believed my children needed their grandparents' approval, that they needed to be part of the Marlowe legacy no matter the cost. But what they truly needed was a father unafraid to stand for dignity, even when it meant walking away. By choosing freedom, I gave them more than any inheritance ever could, a legacy of self-respect. Ethan and Lila would never sit at a table where they were diminished. They would know their value, not because of their last name, but because of the love that surrounded them every single day. And to you, listening to my story now, I say this: sometimes walking away is not a loss, it is the ultimate victory. Sometimes the most powerful act of revenge is not in destruction, but in building a life so whole, so peaceful, so free, that the people who once tried to break you become irrelevant shadows in your rearview mirror. There is a strength in silence, yes, but there is even greater strength in saying no, and meaning it. So when you find yourself at a table where love is rationed, where respect is conditional, and where your worth is measured only by what you provide, remember this: you don't have to stay. You don't have to keep proving yourself to people committed to never seeing you. Walking away is not weakness. It is liberation. If this story spoke to you, hit that hype button right now. You can use up to 3 hypes every week, on this video or others, but each one helps stories like this climb higher so more people see them. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Epic Karma Tale, because the next twist will leave you speechless.